G'day, how you going? And welcome to Season 2 of Over the Moon, the podcast where I talk to you about all things space related, from theories of creation to new rocket prototypes. Today we will be talking about Dr. Wernher Von Braun. Dr. Wernher von Braun is a very famous German rocket scientist who was the man who designed the Saturn V, the rocket to send man to the moon. He was born in the year 1912 on the 23rd of March in the town of, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it, but I think it's Wierzysk, Poland. He was born to Emmy and Magnus von Braun. As a child, he was very interested in astronomy and space in general, so his mother bought him a telescope so that he could look at the stars and the planets. In 1920, his family moved to Berlin, Germany. While at school, he did quite badly, pretty terrible in physics and maths specifically. He was terrible because he didn't actually apply himself into the subject, so he didn't actually want to learn anything, so he didn't learn anything. Until the year 1925, when he bought the book Die Rakete zu den Planettraumen, in English, The Rocket into Interplanetary Space. From then on, he applied himself in school and rose to the top of his class because he actually had something to aspire for. Once he left school, he enrolled in the Berlin Institute of Technology in the year 1930. He then joined the German Society for Space Travel. He was very skilled with rockets, and he helped Oberth in his rocket motor tests. 2 years later, he graduated from the Institute of Technology with a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. With his bachelor, he joined the University of Berlin. By autumn or fall that year, he was having large money problems. During this time, Walter Dornberger was in charge of large researching into the use of solid fuel rockets for war. So basically SRBs, but it's the entire rocket. Walter Dornberger knew that the liquid rockets could also be very useful for war, so he got Wernher von Braun a research grant to set up a test facility next to his own solid rocket fuel technology facility. 2 years later, in 1934, he graduated from the Berlin University with a doctorate in physics. At his liquid fuel test facility, he was doing large researching into combustion engines with between 300 and 660 pounds of thrust. By December, the year after Hitler took over Germany, Braun's group had launched 2 rockets to 2.5 kilometers, or 1.5 miles. Due to Hitler taking over Germany, he had created a decree that rocket launches were illegal. So these launches of the A4 rockets, no, not the A4 rockets, but I think the A4 rockets were actually deemed illegal. The grounds that they were using to launch the A4 rockets were too small for a launch because the A4 required lots of different transport vehicles to actually be able to carry the rocket. So they created a military outpost on the northeastern beach of Peenemünde, or Peenemünde. I'm not sure how these are pronounced, they're all German names. The rocket that they were using was the A4. The A4 was a long-range ballistic missile. The missile was years ahead of any other rocket being used by any other country. Hitler had invaded this facility and demanded that Wernher von Braun join the Nazi party. Von Braun knew that if he didn't join the Nazis, he'd probably be hung as an example of what happens when you disagree with the Nazis, and he'd have all of his life works taken away from him. So he willingly joined the Nazis, which creates a little bit of controversy with him. During the time that Von Braun was a part of the Nazi party, Hitler sent Jewish slaves who were taken from the death concentration camps to build the A4, or, as named by the Nazis, the V2 rocket, or the Vengeance 2 rocket, which was a later variation of the Vengeance 1 flying bomb, which was a plane bomber. Because of the terrible conditions, lots of Jewish slaves died, some due to falling off of the rocket because it was so much bigger than like any other rocket, also because of malnutrition, because they weren't feeding them very well. In 1945, many German cities were targeted by the Allies, which were America as such. They did air raids on German cities, resulting in multiple casualties due to the exploding cities. That is what happens when you explode people. They die. So Hitler decided to launch 11 Vengeance 2 rockets at the Allied cities, including Britain and London. London is a city, Britain isn't. Von Braun was against this. He didn't think that they should be launching the rockets because he didn't want the rockets to be used to kill so many people. So he was arrested by the Nazi party. But Hitler himself actually decided to take von Braun out of the prison to watch the launch of the V2s. Probably to get him annoyed. That year, Hitler was overthrown by the Allied forces, and rather than fighting to save himself, von Braun surrendered himself to the Americans rather than the Soviet Unions. Now, nearing the end of World War II, both the Americans and the Soviet Unions were closing in on Hitler's army. Most of the Nazis ended up handing themselves over to the Americans because they'd much rather live in a progressive country such as America rather than live in Russia with the Soviet Union, where I don't think you are even allowed to leave your own state. So once he moved to America, he took his rocket team with him and his brother. He started working for the US military on the V2 rockets. They continued to use the V2s to do high atmosphere tests because the V2 rocket was the first ever rocket made to pass the Kármán line. If you don't know what the Kármán line is, it's the commonly agreed upon line of space which for Earth is 100 kilometers or 62 miles straight up. In 1952, Von Braun moved to Huntsville, Alabama, or as they pronounce it, Alabama, to become the technical director of America's ballistic missile program, which is a very big title. He created many rockets for America during this time, I believe, such as the Redstone rocket, and in 1955 he was able to apply for US citizenship, which he acquired. In 1958, NASA, or the National Aeronautics Space Agency, I didn't actually write that down, I can remember it all, and I'm very proud of myself, was formed, and Von Braun and his team were transferred from the military outpost to work for NASA. He was given instantly the job of director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. All of his titles were very long. During this time, he helped to develop the prototypes of the Saturn V prototypes, known as the Saturn I and the Saturn 1B. He later also, obviously, developed the Saturn V. I will have an episode on the Saturn V prototypes and the Saturn V moon rocket, and then even later the N1 Soviet Union moon rocket. The Saturn V was the largest and most complicated rocket ever made. This is because Von Braun didn't actually want to go to the moon. He actually wanted to send man to Mars. He just created the Saturn V to progress his career, because, you can't go to Mars without going to the moon. You can, you just shouldn't. Because, you shouldn't just your first human project shouldn't be colonizing another planet. Just like you should, before going to colonize a country, you should at least learn how to get to your surrounding islands. Von Braun was a man with great ambitions, and one of his great ambitions was to send man to the moon. So, because of how ambitious he was, he actually laid out an entire roadmap on how to get to Mars from lower Earth orbit. In his book known as Das Mars Project, or in English, The Mars Project, he outlined an entire manned mission to Mars. And he even included all the maths that would be required, like the fuel amounts and how large the batteries would have to be. He didn't just design something and say, yeah, this should probably work. He made sure that it worked. But we still, in 2020, we still haven't landed man on Mars. So the mission to the moon was overseen by at the time, President Richard Nixon, who you may know as, I believe, the 37th President of the United States. The Apollo program was planned to have 21 or 22 missions, but Richard Nixon decided to call off the last 4 or 5 missions due to possible human life loss. So the mission had ended at NASA, so projects were available to be worked on, specifically 2 projects. They could either create a manned mission to Mars, which would require sending man to Mars, possibly colonizing it, and then possibly sending them back, or you could create a reusable rocket, which we now know as the space shuttle. Richard Nixon obviously went with the space shuttle because we know what it is, because he didn't want to deal with the possibility of human life loss. He looked at the 2 choices and he thought, if we went to Mars, there could be countless amounts of casualties of all people on board. It could be even worse than the Apollo program, which only had 3 life losses. This could have hundreds. Or we could create a space shuttle, which would just be a rocket that can go to lower Earth orbit. So he chose it because less chance of loss of life, and it's much cheaper. So Von Braun spent his life trying to send humans to Mars. So when his project to send man to Mars was denied, he was understandably put off. So he quit his job at NASA and left to join a company called Fairchild Industries. 3 years later, he founded the National Space Institute with the objective of gaining public support and understanding space and the creation of it further. In 1977, so quite a while ago, 43 years ago, he died on the 16th of June due to a pancreas cancer. So in conclusion, I don't like Richard Nixon because he denied a human mission to Mars, which would be either greatly successful and move humans up the evolutionary line, or it could have life loss and we'd just try again, and because he was possibly involved with the Watergate scandal. And Von Braun was a great man despite the fact that it was because of him that many people died. Pluto. What is it? Last season we had That's the Reason, but this time I've changed it up and our That's the Reason section will be known as What's That? Today's question is, what actually is Pluto? If you're older than 20, you probably remember the solar system having 9 planets, going Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Also, it's pronounced Uranus, not Uranus. Get it right. But since 2006, Pluto hasn't actually been considered a planet. Up until 2006, Pluto was a planet, but in August of 2006, the International Astronomical Union decided that it was no longer a planet. From then on, it was known as a dwarf planet, which is also lumped in with trans-Neptunian object, but they're two different things. I might get into it another time. So, this is mostly going to be talking about how does the IAU, or the International Astronomical Union, actually decide what should and shouldn't be considered a planet. That could be what you're asking. For a body to actually be considered a planet, it has to meet 3 criteria. The first requirement is that it orbits around a sun. Pluto does currently orbit around our sun, so it obviously meets that criteria. The second requirement is that it is circular. Pluto has had pictures taken of it by New Horizons, so we do know that it is circular. And the third and final requirement is that the body has cleared the neighborhood of nearby planets. Now, what this means is that the planet has to be far away enough from other nearby planets that it isn't pulled into that planet's orbit, and therefore disturbing its own orbit. Pluto does not, however, meet this requirement. Pluto has been slowly pulled in by Neptune's orbit, which is changing its orbit, because, Neptune is, because of how large it is, it's trying to suck in Pluto, ever so slightly, that Pluto's orbit is slightly changing but as it comes closer and closer to Neptune, and it will possibly one day actually be orbiting Neptune. So in conclusion, Pluto is a dwarf planet because its orbit is being affected by Neptune. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Over the Moon. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next episode where I will talk about the Saturn mission, which includes the Saturn 1, Saturn 1B, Saturn 5, and maybe some of the Apollo missions and how they actually worked. Bye.